I know a lot of people do compare themselves to other runners and all of that, but I do find it's such a personal journey and it's just like you out there. And I have gone through periods of kind of being like, I see great runners and I'm like, oh, I wish I could run like that. But I don't compare myself in the like beat myself up that I can't, because like my own journey is the one that matters and I'm doing it to be out in the hills and having a good time.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure, a podcast looking at unfamiliar places across the world and aspects of travelling you may never have thought of. I'm your host, the Barefoot Backpacker, a middle-aged Denbigh with a passion for offbeat travel, history, culture and the whys behind travel itself. So join with me as we venture beyond the brochure. Hello. I'd give a life update at this point, but I don't really have one. I've done a lot of walking, a small amount of running, had several existential crises, not been anywhere significant unless you count Bognor Regis, and I'm generally bumbling along, always conscious that I'm getting older and no wiser. I will say I'm falling out of love with beer. Well, not out of love per se, more a kind of, I'm not enjoying this as much as I should be. Which is understandable when 80% of it is overly juicy IPAs. One might query Bognor Regis. It's definitely on brand for someone going beyond the brochure, and if it was good enough for King George V, it's good enough for me. That said, he went there for a rest cure in the Victorian tradition, hence the Regis in its name, it being a seaside resort and therefore full of clean air. It didn't work, but then given his penchant for tobacco, it's not surprising. I can't find any reference to how much he smoked, only that by the end of his life he needed oxygen tanks. He wasn't impressed with Bognor, anyway. There's an urban rumour that, on the suggestion he can go back there for another rest cure, his last words before his death were, "Bugger Bognor." They were not, but he may have had a point. I only went there to mark Bestie's birthday, and even then only because it was cheaper than Bristol. To be fair, the purpose wasn't Bognor itself, but nearby Arundel Castle, a place that's been on my hit list since I started playing the regularly mentioned on this pod board game Kingmaker, which had the castle as one of its important locations, and the name of which I liked enough to co-opt into my own stories and personal culture. I have, however, been pronouncing it incorrectly all my life, because having never heard it before, and only seeing it written down, I originally read it as Arundel, and old habits die hard. Anyway, it's quite a spectacular castle, ridiculously large, so many different styles contained within it, and a correspondingly large gardens area that with every step you feel like you're in a different part of the world. The town itself is somewhat cute, with great farm-type shops and a couple of decent pubs. Definitely better than Bognor, a seaside town less interesting than Skegness, and with only a pebble beach and not a proper sandy one. We did have fun watching people do pub karaoke though, and no, we didn't participate. Mainly because we were too late to ask. Speaking of music, I have bought a ticket to a second concert this year, and, like the one in August, it's quite retro. Deacon Blue, a Scottish 1980s pop-rock blues band I kinda like, are touring and they've got 2 nights at the Peace Hall in Halifax in early July, so I thought it would be cool to go. It does mean standing up for about 3.5 hours in the open air, but you'd think a summer concert would at least bring summer weather. You would think. And yet. That's partly a subtweet, but also a reference to my pod from 2024 about travelling for music that you might want to check out. Speaking of Scotland, I do need to go to Glasgow at some point to get my hair recoloured. It's been so long now that I'm looking quite grey and old from the front, one of the 2 hair-related reasons that I like wearing hats. It's still very purple at the ends though, so I'm still getting impressed vibes from random people. And then I'll need to get it touched up again in early October, because there's a period when I'll be doing a lot, and some of it specifically designed to impress people. Though not those sorts of people. I'm not in the dating market. Yet. Last year, I released a podcast episode called How Not to Run an Ultramarathon. I was reminded of that a couple of times recently, partly because the 2026 edition of the Calderdale Way Ultra took place at the end of April, and I I mean, I had FOMO, not going to lie, but also, there's no way I was ultra ready. Let's be real, I'm barely even parkrun ready. But also because a couple of weekends ago, I hiked over the last section of it, from Todmorden Town Centre to Heptonstall. By last section, I mean not only the final segment if you were to be running it, but also the last part of the footpath as a whole that I'd not yet been on. I'm not entirely sure how long a section that is, but it does involve 2 hills that the race organisers lovingly dub Little Bastard and Big Bastard. The footpath goes back into Todmorden between the two, meaning there's far easier ways to do that bit of the journey, and then later on goes past a great big rock perched by a junction of country lanes. And in true River Avon style, that rock's official name is Great Rock. The final section into Heptonstall goes past, well, above the poet Ted Hughes' old home, that's now a writing retreat run by the Arvin Foundation, before spending the last half-mile or so picking its way through some boulders in the middle of a thick wood with a dangerously close steep drop to the right. Fantasy authors would love it. Having now walked its entire length, I'm much more aware of the task in hand were I to run it again. The route crosses the Calder twice, and I'm pretty certain the route on the northern side is much, much harder and more intense than on the southern side, so maybe the 30-mile version that starts in Brickhouse is much more suitable. We'll see. That's a decision for 2027 Nell to take. 2025 Nell, however, was not content with having tried and failed to complete an ultra, and so later that year they signed up for a second one, just to prove to themselves that yes, they were capable of moving that distance, and no, they weren't lying to themselves. If you were listening to episodes I made at the time, you'll know that I did finish it, and finish it pretty well, but also that I'd talk about it more at some point on an episode in the future. I kept putting it off because I wanted to bring Seanna in to discuss ultramarathons with as well, but for one reason or another, life events and more pressing podcast episodes were made. But having finally chatted with them, and you can hear that in my previous episode, this seems like the right time to talk about the ultra that I did finish. It was called the Pilgrims Ultra, as it largely followed the route of the St Oswald's Way footpath in Northumberland in northeast England. All I knew about it when I signed up was that it was mostly flat, running as it does along the coast for much of its route, that it was an end-to-end route rather than a loop, so I'd have a series of logistics to administer, and that it being in mid-September, so after my 50th birthday, meant that I had a jump scare when it came to assigning my race category. What do you mean I'm in the higher age category? That can't be right. Oh, bugger. I could also enter as non-binary, and we'll come back to that at the end of this pod. That it was mostly flat was why I chose it, not going to lie. One might argue after the Calderdale Way, pretty much anything might be regarded as being mostly flat, but this one had a total elevation gain of 540 metres, which I'd probably achieved within the first couple of hours on the Calderdale Way route. I was also drawn to the coastal setting of it. It had been a while since I'd spent much time at the coast, and I did kind of miss it. Plus the route passed through a part of the country I'd been around much on 2 of my childhood family holidays, a topic I'll be doing a podcast about specifically later in the year. And indeed, the route went right through the village of Sea Houses where we'd stayed. I'd never been back to the area since, so I was interested to see if I remembered anything about it. There were 3 race options: 50 kilometres, 100 kilometres and 100 miles. Let me tell you, as soon as I decided to do it, there was absolutely no hesitation in choosing the 50 kilometres. I'd already overestimated my abilities once that year. I wasn't going to do it again. As it turns out, one of my friends in the Queer Runnings group, Vic, had signed up for the 100 kilometres, and she was definitely prepared for a day of pain. I'd never actually met her before, so it was nice to catch up just before the start of the race. Also, there was another Queer Runnings member, Chloe, who was an event photographer, so I saw her flittering around at the start and then at a couple of points on the way. She took a few photographs of me that I posted to my Instagram feed a couple of days after the race. Note, by the way, that the actual distance of the 50k was 51.9k and that of the 100k was 102.3, because actual race distances are vague beasts and determined by the path and the endpoints rather than the other way round. That said, if you're in the market for running 100k, an extra 2.3 at the end is probably fairly inconsequential. The 100 mile is reported to be actually 154.93 kilometres if you track the GPX file, which works out at just under 96.3 miles, but I don't know if I'd feel shortchanged about that. Honestly, I'd probably be quite happy to finish an hour and a half earlier than I expected. Not that I'd finish at all, because, yes, I've walked 100 miles, but over the course of 4 or 5 days, with sleep and meals and beer in the interim. The cut-off for that race is 30 hours. No. But let's go back a day. Because of the point-to-point nature of the race, working out logistics was a little tricky and added to the expense. I mentioned on my previous pod that ultra running isn't quite as accessible to all as you'd hope, given these extra logistical costs you need to factor in for a race. The race's hub and finish of the 50k was in a small coastal village called Craster, which is served by buses every couple of hours. But the start of all the races, and therefore all of the check-in admin, was done on Holy Island, about 25 kilometres north-northwest in a straight line, at about 8 a.m. The organisers wouldn't set up shop in Craster until everyone had left Holy Island. They laid on shuttle buses from Craster to Holy Island at the cost of about £20, but that meant I'd still have to get to Craster for 5:30 a.m. or whenever they set off, and the buses don't run that early. Craster's not very big, and not very convenient for, anything much, so I chose to overnight in nearby Alnwick, 11 kilometres away by road, and get a taxi in. I'll come back to talking a little bit about Alnwick itself towards the end of the pod. To get to the shuttle buses, though, I ended up sharing a taxi with someone else doing exactly the same thing at the suggestion of the taxi firm, no less. Under normal circumstances, I would question the safety aspect of this, but honestly, if you're going to run an ultra, that is absolutely not something that's on your mind. Everybody knows who you are and where you are, because we all have trackers. You'd wreck your race, and your fitness programme probably wouldn't allow for it anyway. The shuttles left in the dark, but by the time we arrived on Holy Island, it was just dawning, and the final couple of miles were pretty awe-filled, with the sun rising over the sand dunes in an otherwise flat seascape. I don't know how many of you know much about Holy Island, but it's one of those places that's definitely worth a day trip on its own. Holy Island, also known as Lindisfarne, is a small island off the coast of Northumberland, just south of the Scottish border. It's a minimum of 400 hectares in size. It shrinks and grows with the tide, which makes it a little bigger than New York Central Park. I say island. At low tide, there's a causeway you can drive across, and it's even possible to walk along the sands and the mudflats if you know what you're doing. There is a marked path. It's part of 2 long-distance footpaths. High tide floods both, so if your car battery dies because you're listening to too much cricket while parked outside the cafes, you're stuck there for 6 hours longer than anticipated. As happened to us last time I was here, in the mid-80s, on a family holiday. The epithet Holy Island was given to it maybe 1,000 years ago, on account of it having been a centre of religion for several centuries at that point. An abbey was founded here in the 630s, and there was some kind of monastery present from then until Henry VIII got rid of them all in 1536. It was one of the most important monasteries of the country for a time, and the 2 footpaths that start or end here are both named after saints associated with it. Oswald, King of Northumbria, who ordered its foundation by St Aidan, and whose path runs south along the coast before heading inland to Heavenfield near Hexham, where he won a battle, and Cuthbert, the patron saint of Northumberland, who was both abbot and bishop here in the mid to late 600s, and whose path goes to Melrose Abbey in the Scottish borders. It was kind of abandoned after being the first site in England to be attacked and conquered by the Vikings, June the 8th, 793 apparently, so roughly in line with this podcast episode. But it was rebuilt as a priory after the Norman conquest. There's still substantial remains of walls of the later priory at least, so you can definitely get a feel for what it would have looked like. Some of the stone from the priory was used to construct Lindisfarne Castle in 1550. Castle is a bit grandiose for what was effectively only a defensive fortification, doubly so given the mainland is full of proper castles dating from earlier times when the Scottish and the English fought a lot. The Treaty of Norham that basically finalised the issues between them was signed on the 10th of June 1551, so again, prescient for this podcast. The final religious site on the island is St Mary the Virgin Church. It was built around the same time and it still exists and is still used, presumably making it one of the oldest churches still in use in the country, although it has been heavily refurbed and restored in the interim. It is possible to stay on the island, but for the purposes of this ultra, it would have made the logistics of getting back after the end slightly awkward, let alone getting off the island to go back home on the Sunday. It would feel like a good place to get away from it all, like some kind of writing retreat. Isn't that just a simplified version of what a monastery is anyway? If it weren't for all the tourists. As an aside, while waiting for the start, I had an amble around the tourist sites. I have to admit I didn't readily remember any of them from my previous visit, but then I might only have been about 7 or 8 at the time. It being so early on a Saturday meant that none of them were open. But it also meant that there were no other tourists around, or at least not many. I'm not saying the ruins of the Prior itself were visited illicitly by a series of runners. What I am saying is that there would have been nothing to stop them clambering over low stone walls to have a look around them without paying. Runners are so rude and entitled. Maybe. Anyway, back to the race admin. The shuttle bus got us to the race check-in quite a while before the off of the race, maybe an hour and a half. Not everyone was on those buses, of course, and people kept arriving in bits and bobs the whole time. What they wanted to do at check-in was to make sure that we were, registered for the race, that we had enough of the mandatory kit to be comfortable, and to give us a spare paper map. As it was a point-to-point race, we could also arrange drop bags of stuff to be picked up at Craster. This was mainly for the 100k and 100-mile runners to use Craster as a let's swap out a load of stuff, get changed, pick up head torches, etc. location, so they didn't have to run the first 50k with a whole lot of stuff they didn't need. But I used the facility too to ensure that I had, for instance, my coat available to me at the end. The weather forecast was mixed, with rain expected in the afternoon. It had been showery for a couple of days prior, and while most of the run was on either roads or relatively firm coastal paths, this was the northeast of England, so winds and weather can be quite fresh at times. Weather had been one of the things I was concerned about on my previous ultra, as that route was on a lot of grassy and earthy paths, and you'll know how much I just love going downhill on mud. This route was more on solid ground and sand dune, but still too much rain could make for miserable going. In any case, I knew that there was a chance of rain at some point, and I didn't want to have to make it back to my hotel resembling a drowned rat, especially if I was not moving particularly freely after the race. The race itself started slightly later than advertised, from a wide open field on the way to the castle. It was an interesting feeling, standing around in a shelter out of the breeze before the start. I wouldn't say I felt worried. Possibly a little apprehensive, because 30 miles is a long way. In the days before the race, I was calculating in my head about how fast I would have to be to make the cut-off of 8 hours, meaning I'd have to run an average pace of 15.5 minutes a mile, which is slightly slower than my average walking pace, but I can only keep that up for about 10 miles. I imagined myself sprinting through Craster with an electronic timer above my head, counting up to 4 p.m. and making it over the line at 3:59:59. But other than that, I felt quite calm. My worry was over the time more than the distance. I knew I'd done a similar distance on my previous attempt at the Ultra over much more challenging topography, and I knew this was going to be a much easier run on the body. I was also concerned about the weather. There was a small shower a few minutes before the start, and I've never been fond of running in the rain. But other than that, I think I was fine. I had a last-minute toilet visit, along with everybody else. You know you're in an ultra when the queue for the men's toilets is longer than the queue for the women's toilets, because obviously men leave everything to the last minute, even if it's far easier and quicker for them to go surreptitiously behind a bush or a tree. Then, around 8:20 a.m, we were off. All 3 races started at the same time, so everybody was running together regardless of distance. The first 4 miles were flat, completely flat, over the causeway that we'd driven the shuttle bus in on, which meant that we were stopping traffic pretty much the whole way. I don't know what the tourists in their cars would have thought of us as we passed, possibly annoyed that they were forced to wait and crawl along while they visited a time-dependent tourist site. I ambled slowly, getting used to moving, not pushing myself too hard. It's a long way, and I didn't want to burn out too soon. It was nice to be running with people, and actually it wasn't until close to the end of the race when I felt truly on my own, and even then it didn't last very long. I was ahead of Vic. This wasn't intentional, as I'd planned to use her as a pacemaker for that first section, knowing that she was doing double the distance that I was. But she was having, shall we say, some technical issues, and it took her a little while to get moving. The hill, or at least the mound, its highest point was 154 metres, was roughly a 7-kilometre section that started with a long straight country lane before meandering along a narrow trail through the woods. It was surprisingly pleasant and didn't feel too onerous at all, but I guess that's what happens when you live and train in the moorlands. I had a map with me, as we all did, but it was hard to get lost as there was always someone a little way ahead of me. It also wasn't that rough underfoot, not nearly as muddy and slippery as I'd feared. I reached the first checkpoint around 11 a.m, so after about 2 hours and 40 minutes of movement. This was a small gathering of marshals and volunteers at the village of Belford, at the bottom of the hill, but not not quite yet at the coastal path. I didn't pause here long, just long enough to have a water break, a packet of running gel and some chocolate. I was 20 kilometres in at this point, so just under 40% of the way through already, and I felt absolutely fine, quite enthused even. And in a sense, I knew the hardest part was behind me, so to speak. Everything from this point in might be awkward at times, but it wouldn't be hilly. If I were to maintain this pace, I'd be done in about 6 hours and 55, which would be a perfectly respectable time. The route to the coast went along more country trails, past farmers' fields, and at one point directly over the East Coast Main Railway line, at quite a wide point too, with no warning lights, which felt a little precarious, not going to lie, but fortunately at a section where you could see deep into the distance at either direction. The route itself also crossed the main A1 road twice, but at least at those points there were marshals making sure everything was hunky-dory. 5 kilometres after leaving Belford, and thus about the halfway point of the race, I reached the coast. Everything from here on in, aside from a short section just south of Bamburgh, would be on roads or coastal footpaths, with the sea to the left. It would be incredibly difficult to get lost on this route, and it's not a spoiler alert to say that I didn't. There were a couple of points where I was a little unsure of the exact route, including on the way into the Bamburgh checkpoint itself, where the designated route slightly deviated from the St Oswald's Way marked footpath, but it was easily resolved, even if it did involve a little too much sand than I'd liked. The checkpoint at Bamburgh was a proper setup with several tables of snackage and drinkage. It was on the edge of a golf course and pretty much underneath one of the walls of Bamburgh Castle. It was at 30 kilometres and I reached it about 12:30 p.m. after being on the move for a shade under 4 hours and 8 minutes. This put me on target for a finish of around 7 hours and 10 minutes, though I spent 10 minutes there resting and taking on another gel and some nibbles, so I was now targeting around 7 hours and 20, getting slower and would continue to do so, but not alarmingly so. According to Wikipedia, Bamburgh has a population of just over 400, which feels remarkably low and surprising given the town's provenance over the years. It's a nice little seaside settlement in and of itself, but its importance is very much historical. It may have been the capital of the ancient Saxon kingdom of Bernicia, which was later subsumed into Northumbria. It's kind of the gateway to Holy Island, and it's close to the main road that crossed the border between the English kingdoms and the Scottish ones. Unsurprisingly, its most notable feature, though, is that castle. And indeed, as castles go, it's one of the bigger ones. It's around 46 metres high, and it stands itself on a basalt rock about 55 metres tall, while Google Maps suggests the building itself is around 220 metres long and 65 metres wide at its most distant. What stands was originally built by the Normans not long after the conquest and expanded as long ago as the reign of Henry II about 100 or so years later, but there's been some kind of fort here since, well, seemingly just after the Romans left. The castle's own website notes both a literary vibe, that it was the home of Sir Lancelot, and a historical one, that during the Wars of the Roses it became the first castle in the world to be captured using gunpowder. These days it's one of those places that hosts reenactments and jousts, neither of which I noticed when I was stood outside it for 10 minutes going, well, 10 more miles to go, and the clouds are gathering. When I was making notes about the run for this pod, I wrote that the route beyond Bamburgh was, quote, the wilderness years, unquote. By this point the field was quite spread out, though I was overtaking people more than being overtaken, which to be honest surprised even me. On the way into Sea Houses we had the first really noticeable rain shower, though it only lasted a couple of minutes. The landscape became a lot more around sand dunes and salty air, quaint little villages here and there. Well, maybe. The clouds became much greyer and sullen, the wind picked up, and it definitely felt like there was more rain that was going to come. I passed through Sea Houses relatively speedily and through the golf course beyond, because everything up here seems to be golf courses if you get away from the cliffs. Despite having 2 family holidays in the town back in the early 80s, nothing at all about it felt familiar. I mean, I know it's going to have changed quite a lot aesthetically since then. You'd have thought at least structurally and conceptually, though, I'd remember things like the town layout, the beach, the surrounding vibes, but no. All I remember about those holidays seems to have been the town names and the failure to get out of Holy Island in good enough time. Off the coast here are the Farne Islands, a series of around 15 to 20 islets, skerries and other rocks that were once occupied by monks but are now largely empty, save for some wildlife rangers. Like St Kilda off the far west of Scotland, the Farne Islands are home to a large number of seabirds, mainly puffins and guillemots, but over 300 species have been here over the years. I do recall my visit over there as a kid was where I first heard the word shag. Even the lighthouses are automated these days, but one of the reasons the islands are vaguely known about is because in September 1838, a paddle steamer called the Forfarshire ran aground here and some horrendously bad weather with 61 passengers and crew on board. 9 left on a lifeboat and made it to shore. The remainder were left clinging to what remained of the ship and then to the rocks themselves. Most of them quickly failed. And that would have been that, had it not been for the intransigence of Grace Darling, the 22-year-old daughter of one of the lighthouse keepers, around 550 metres from the crash site, so it was all definitely very visible, even in such bad conditions, and she kept demanding to her father that they go out and rescue the remainder. She estimated there were about 13 people who were still in situ clinging to the rock. He relented the next morning, and they rowed out, and in 2 trips managed to rescue the 9 people who were left alive by then. They were both well rewarded, receiving medals from the forerunner of the RNLI, as well as a considerable sum from donations. You would have thought this would have set her up for life, but sadly she died 4 years later from tuberculosis, because life does that to people sometimes. The next town I reached was Beadnell, or Beadnell, I don't know, where I was starting to feel the exertion. It was around 2:10 and I'd been moving at that point for 40 3/4 kilometres, and I paused for a couple of minutes to nibble, rest and have another running gel, which did enough to perk me up for the next 5k. I parked myself on a low wooden fence or bench outside a beachfront grill place that was absolutely not open for the season. This part of the world is very definitely beach holiday territory, albeit a very different sort of beach holiday to that you might find in Skegness or Bognor Regis. This is much quieter, slightly more genteel, home more to the retired and to the very young children, rather than stag do's and karaoke parties. The last 10k were mostly on trails through sand dunes and grassy mounds, which all felt quite away from anywhere. This was the section where I felt weirdly more comfortable jogging than walking, or at least it ached less if I was jogging. There were a couple of guys running together and we kept passing each other as we alternately sped up and eased back. I crossed a wooden bridge over a small river, and I knew from my planning that once I hit this point I'd run a marathon, so everything left was in ultra territory. I had a weird reaction to this. I kind of relaxed. It was almost as if I knew I didn't have anything else to prove, that I knew I was going to make it within the time, so I felt myself just chill out a bit and slow down, or rather I let myself slow down. Halfway between Beadnell and Craster, apparently a shade under 46k, was the small village of Low Newton. I popped into a public toilet here for what may have been my first wee en route, had some more water, but did not have a final running gel, for reasons I'll discuss later. Maybe it would have been better on balance, but honestly, I don't think it really mattered at this point. Having said which, the last 5 kilometres was horrendous. The route went alongside Dunstanburgh Golf Club on a theoretical grass path that was basically entirely mud. I have little balance on mud at the best of times, so imagine how hard it was for me when I was basically a lumbering pool noodle. When I tried to increase my pace, I felt a twinge in my thigh that subsided when I returned to a walk. The people I'd been swapping positions with since sea houses mostly all disappeared into the distance in this section, and I felt slow. The rain had started to come down too, and on the section past the ruins of Dunstanburgh Castle, on a path mostly made of ragged pebbles, I felt very uncomfortable. Also, by this point, I knew I must be getting really close to the end, but every time I turned a corner or went through a gate or reached the crest of a small incline, there was no visibility of Craster at all. This was the only point where I really angsted about the difference between 50k and 51.9k. Dunstanburgh Castle is a cliff-top ruin, one of those places that just feels evocative, especially in the grey skies. Standing on the cliff, looking at it in the distance, feeling like it's at the end of the earth. People have fortified this place since pre-Roman times, but it seems to have suffered from being owned by people who supported the wrong side in several of the civil wars over the centuries, as well as it being too close to Bamburgh Castle, and equally not close to any significant town. It had been decaying significantly even as early as the 1500s, and now it's just a ruin, weather-beaten, but still just about standing, a bit like an ultra runner after 29 miles. But soon enough, the end was near, one slight final incline to the finish near a pub called the Jolly Fisherman. Crossing the line with about 2 or 3 other people kind of felt apt, and I was mostly exhilarated that I'd completed it. Apart from achy legs, didn't actually feel too bad for it. I wandered to what I think was the church hall where the checkpoint, more nibbles and the drop bags were, sat down, and then found I could barely stand up having done so. I got changed very slowly, picked up my medal and T-shirt, and then made my way back to the pub. I had over an hour before my bus back to Alnwick, and spent it in what turns out to have been a very crowded place. I did at least get a seat after a while at the bar, and because of my exhilarations, and while nowhere near as bad as after the Calderdale Way, I was still having trouble swallowing, so it took me much of the time that I had to drink just that 1 pint. I then limped to the bus stop just down the road, in the rain, and headed back to Alnwick. I reached the end about 4 p.m, and my finish time in the end was 7 hours 41 minutes and 26 seconds, apparently, so slightly slower than my earlier pace suggested, but honestly still well within tolerances, and to be honest, I'm pretty happy with that. After my did not finish at the Calderdale Way, I didn't tell as many people that my progress was able to be tracked online, but the Queer Runnings group knew, and they were very validating of my performance in their Discord dot watching channel. As an aside, Vic, who was doing the 100k, reached Craster only 6.5 minutes behind me. All I can say is that there's no way I could have done an additional 50k. I don't know if I could have done an additional 5k, to be honest. I didn't do a lot that night. My room in Alnwick had a large deep bath with all manner of jet points, which looked like it was going to be exactly what I needed. But sadly, I couldn't get any hot water out of the bath taps, only the sink taps, and those jet points didn't seem to work. But I went in anyway and just about managed to get out of it afterwards. The rain didn't stop until long after I'd fell asleep, but at least for me it started just as it was finishing. Had I have had more of the run to do, I wouldn't have enjoyed it anywhere near as much. The next morning, I felt mostly fine. I was a bit slower walking than normal, but certainly nowhere near as achy or as troubled as last time. It was also quite a nice morning, weather-wise, so I had a little wander around Alnwick. It's a town that deserves a visit in more relaxing circumstances. For one thing, it's the most significant town in the area, with a population of about 8,500, thus making it a good base for the surrounds, which is exactly why I chose it. It's also notable for an old railway station building that's now a fabulous bookshop called Barter Books, and not only has its stone interior been kept, but also the shop is full of railway memorabilia, even down to a small model railway operating above head height. Alnwick's most famous for, though, like Banba, having a large castle that was well used throughout the years, and indeed it's still inhabited, by the Duke of Northumberland, in fact. Wikipedia tells me that it's the second largest inhabited castle in the country. You don't need me to tell you the largest. And also the 10th most visited stately home in the country. Alnwick Castle was also the birthplace of Henry Percy, also known as Harry Hotspur, a knight skilled and famous enough to have had the ear of kings at the turn of the 14th century, before he fell out with one and got killed in battle. This seems to happen a lot. He's known to modern audiences mostly for being the main character in a Shakespeare play, albeit Henry IV Part 1 isn't one of the more popular ones, and for being the reason Tottenham Hotspur Football Club are called Hotspur, which I did not know until I wrote this podcast. On the way home, I pondered about future ultras, now that I know that I can do them. I didn't book any, though. That's the sort of thing most people do, and I resisted. I have still resisted. At the start of the year, I browsed through many of the ultras that were going to be organised in 2026 and made a note of them. At least I made a note of a few of them as potentials, but even as of this podcast, I have not booked any of them. I had a very lethargic winter, owing to the weather, so I don't feel fit enough right now. We'll see what happens by August, I guess. So, the route I did was officially 51.9 kilometres, with a total elevation gain of 540 metres, most of which was that hill between 7 and 15k. My average speed went down slightly after Beadnell, at 40 kilometres, but it's hard to judge exactly because it's so variable. And the organisers provided a graph. Unfortunately, on that graph, the speed and the altitude are shared with the x-axis, so the x-axis is stupidly big. What I can tell you is that the first hour was just under 10 kilometres an hour, because it was flat and I was running with a lot of people. It vibes though, like until Beadnell, I was going around 8 kilometres an hour, and after Beadnell, it was about 5 kilometres an hour. I can probably work it out accurately with photo timestamps, to be honest, but I'm not sure I can go into that much detail. I finished roughly 101st, albeit about 4 or 5 people finished in a very similar time. I only recall one of them, a lady I'd done the last half mile with, after a whole gaggle of people passed me in the fields after Dunstanburgh Castle, where I was going, surely I'm at the end now. They all finished in about 7:37. A couple of people I kept overtaking the last 6 miles eventually peeled away from me and finished around 7:29 and 7:30. 119 people finished the 50k, a remarkably low dropout rate of 2.5%. The slowest time was 8 hours 31:40 seconds, so I needn't have been worried about cut-offs. That said, the person who finished 108th did so in a time of 7 hours 59 and 55, and 109th was 8 hours and 1 second, so I imagine they both had exactly the same kind of finish as had been in my head at the start. 3 people retired, all at the Bamber checkpoint, though interestingly 2 of them were going considerably faster than I was, so I'm guessing they had to quit because of injury, which is always a shame but also necessary because sometimes your body is telling you things like, if you ignore it, you'll suffer more in the long run, like Seanna in my previous episode. Of those 122 entrants, 81, or just under 2/3, registered as male, including the winner, Harvey Martin, who completed in 4 hours 9 minutes and 2 seconds, which means he finished just about the time I was wandering around the Bamber checkpoint looking for the water tap. His average speed was around 8 minutes a mile, which, when I was a teenager, was very slightly more than the speed I completed the Southport half marathon in. Less than half the length, even flatter, and no, there's no way I could have done another one immediately afterwards. The leading woman, Elisabetta Gimenton, finished 4th in 4 hours 32:34. Note that she was also in the over 40 category, 68 seconds behind John Paul Hunt, the leading male over 40. I also mentioned this in my last episode. Ultramarathons are a home for older runners. Of the 122 entrants, 57% were over 40, scattered across all of the finishing times, and included 2 over 60s men, one of whom finished 8 minutes behind me, so there's still hope. The other, sadly, finished 12th, before I'd even reached Beadnell. There was precisely one non-binary runner, who consequently was listed first in both their category and their age grading. I did not realise or appreciate this when I crossed the finish line. I was just happy to have completed the course and didn't even really care about my time, never mind that I just conceptually won something in a race for the first time in my life. I only found out when I looked at the results a couple of days later when I got back to Calderdale. I didn't get a special trophy, or indeed anything, for winning. To be honest, I think I'd have been slightly embarrassed too, given that I was the only entrant, and nor was I expecting one. But as Seanna said in the last episode, it's nice to be honoured, if only to show other people that we exist. As for the other races, the 100k, with a cut-off of 18 hours, saw 42 entrants, 24 finishers, dropout rate of 43%, though this includes one runner who didn't start. Many of them retired at Craster, and the majority of those being well ahead of me in time at that point. Which is something to consider. Enter a longer race and see how you feel at the end of the shorter one. I'd argue it doesn't count to say you completed an ultra, and because you entered the longer race you wouldn't probably get a medal for finishing the shorter one, but of course it's not about medals, it's about your own personal achievement. Just as I say I ran an ultra when I didn't finish the Calderdale Way Ultra. It just wasn't the ultra I was trying to run. The winner of the 100k was Sam Stevenson in 10 hours 42 minutes and 52 seconds, or around 7 p.m. I think I was just about back in Alnwick by then, trying hard to walk. In keeping with the 50k, second place went to over 40 female runner Kate Halleman, and the last finisher was Queer Running's Vic, 17 hours 44 minutes 15 seconds, around 2 a.m. I think I'd stopped tracking her at that point because sleep was more important, given that I wasn't staying an extra night and I needed to be in Newcastle by lunchtime. I saw the pictures and her thoughts the next day. The rain that I'd experienced not long after finishing continued into the night, and that second 50k looked like it was incredibly unpleasant compared to the first 50k. Exactly the sort of weather I was fearing. As for the 100-miler, with a cut-off of 30 hours, it saw 38 entrants, 17 finishers, with a dropout rate of 55%. The vast majority of these dropped out at Rothbury, the endpoint of the 100k, which feels kind of based. The winner, Graham Malthouse, finished in 19 hours 39 minutes and 40 seconds, or about 4 a.m. Yeah, nah. The last finisher was Gary Butler in 31 hours 32 minutes and 55 seconds, a bit before 4 p.m. Sunday afternoon, by which point I was almost back in Calderdale. Also, nah. The huge difference in dropout rates suggests very much that people who entered these ultras were those that know they can do the distances. In fact, if you look at where people dropped out, across all 3 races, only 6 failed to complete an ultra distance, 3 in the 50k and 3 in the 100k, including the non-starter. Every single person in the 100-miler reached 50k, and all bar 1 reached a Walkworth checkpoint at 72k. I don't know why those who dropped out did so, but I imagine many of them were, as I thought, injury-related, which, let's face it, could happen even in a park run, while some simply went, you know what, I've done a lot, I've run an ultra, I've had fun, but I've had enough today. It doesn't feel like people felt out of their depth, conceptually at least, more a case of experienced people testing their limits, people who know they can do ultras, but are just trying to push themselves to the next level of it. Just to look a little more into the 100k specifically, its elevation gain is 1,169 metres, which is twice as much as the 50k. Most of that extra elevation looks on the graph like it's almost entirely over the last 30k after the Warkworth checkpoint. Not a 500 metre hill, but rather a long, gradual rise reaching to 100 metres, with ups and downs along the way, making it all mostly not flat and not much space to run on a section that's going to give you more energy back. You're always going uphill. Not a very steep uphill, but you're always going uphill. One of my cross-country teachers at school used to do 10 miles for fun. He probably does ultras even now, to be fair. He could only have been about 6 years older than me. And he once said that after a few miles, the downhills hurt just as much as the uphills. Even hiking on the Calderdale Way, I can confirm this. And I guess after 72 kilometres, even a bridge is probably painful in both directions. This also might explain the large dropout here from the 100-miler. It's at the end of a tougher section than the coastal path, and also a convenient point to quit. Having said which, the majority of 100k ultras are going to be a lot more technical and tough, so if you were thinking of doing 100k, this wouldn't be a bad one to start off with. If it were an 80k or a 50-miler, I'd be vaguely tempted, because it's going to be much easier than the Calderdale Way. But it's not, so it's unlikely. But what do I know? Now, let's go back to my podcast about the Calderdale Way Ultra for a bit and look at the lessons learnt from my experience and see if I ended up following them in preparation for this one. Listener, I can see your wry grin from here. The first was to, quote, take training seriously even if you intend to walk most of it, unquote. Now, I don't remember doing anything more in the run-up to the Pilgrims Way Ultra than I was already doing, but I think in my head it was more a case of, if I can do 50k on the Calderdale Way, I can do the 50k that I need to on the Pilgrim Way. My preparations were slightly stymied by a week in Norway, but honestly, I was walking around a lot even there, and the hill at Sarkafargan was much more in keeping with Calderdale than Northumberland. I knew I could do 50k, and I certainly knew I could do 50k on the flat. I might not be comfortable with it by the end, but I was pretty sure I'd make the cut-offs. As an aside, I absolutely knew that I couldn't have done the 100k, no matter how benign it was. But having already done 30 miles of an ultra meant that I absolutely took the race seriously, possibly too seriously if I'm being honest. I may have overthought it, but I think that's better than timing out after 20 miles because of naivety. Second, quote, do not go off too fast and do not be influenced by those around you, unquote. As I say, the first 4 miles of the Pilgrim Ultra are completely flat. I was prepared for this before the start, and while I didn't walk them, I certainly kept close to the rear of the field as much as possible. I was overtaken on that causeway by innumerable people, but you know what? That felt fine. In the country section up the hill, I slowly made my way back through the field, and it was only in the last 5 miles that I ended up dropping behind others. As I say, by then, I knew I was going to finish the race, so I didn't feel it mattered anymore. It would have been so easy to set off really quickly on that race, and it would absolutely have caught up with me by the time I reached the Bamber checkpoint. Although, if I was fitter, who knows. Thirdly, quote, make sure you can read a map and follow signposts and directions, unquote. The nice thing about this particular route is that it's actually really hard to get lost. On the first section, there's literally only one road. On the mid-section, there's enough runners around to be able to follow, and once you reach the coast after about 40 miles in, the rest of the route is literally, can you see the sea on your left? Yes, then you're more or less on the right route. There's a few sections where the path goes through the dunes rather than on the road, and in a couple of the villages there's possible ways of taking the wrong route, but ultimately, even if you do go wrong, it'll only be by a handful of metres rather than a couple of miles. And also, I can't remember any point on the entire race where either I couldn't see anyone ahead of me or where there was any possible alternative route to take. That said, I did take a map and screenshots of a map and looked out for signs. If you're worried about getting lost though, this is an ideal ultra to do. Fourth and fifth are to do with nutrition. Quote, drink more water or flat pop or soda. Don't wait until you're thirsty as it'll be too late by then, unquote. And of course the related, quote, take food that's easy to eat while still providing energy, unquote. So, having learnt from my sore throat after the Calderdale Way Ultra, I made sure I had enough food and drink to manage throughout that was soft and easy to eat and didn't require much chewing. At the 8-kilometre post, the Tang Fastics came out. I made sure my water bottles, plural, were filled up, making use of the checkpoints to do that, but also I took several running gels. These are literally liquid fruit-flavoured sugar. Let me tell you now, they are like crack. At the Bamber checkpoint, I was feeling a little weary, but letting that much sugar and sweetness fall down my throat, stop it, perked me up no end. It was weird. I'd not used them before, but I experimented with a couple of packets on my way to and from the Halifax Park Run a month or so earlier. And not going to lie, it did feel like I was taking some kind of banned substance, so I knew I liked them and I knew I felt comfortable using them. The downside of the gels is that they tend to come out just as easy as they go in. I was feeling weary at low Newton, shade less than 3 miles from the finish, but I actively chose not to have a final gel, which I think would have been my 5th, possibly my 6th, purely because I know what would have happened had I have done so. Sure, I finished about 20 minutes later than I otherwise would have done, but the toilets in Craster would have thanked me enormously. I don't know what I'd have done if I'd have been doing the 100k. I was wearing a skort, not a skirt, something that I might have to bear in mind if I ever do 100k. One of the people I follow on Instagram recently ran a road marathon in a sundress, so there's precedent in my bubble. The last lesson learnt from my previous pod was, quote, most importantly, choose your race carefully and take your ability level seriously. Don't just go with the first you see because you think it'll be fun, unquote. And, to be fair, I did choose this ultra purposely because, although I felt it would be fun, I also knew it was one I'd be likely to finish. I knew what I was capable of, or rather, I knew what I wasn't capable of in terms of terrain, topography and distance, so I think I chose well. I mean, I finished it, so I was obviously correct. Well, that's about all for this pod. Join me next time for another adventure beyond the brochure. Until then, remember that quite often you're capable of more than you think you are, even if it takes something like pure sugar to get you to do it. And if you're feeling off colour, which you might be if you take too many of those pure sugar gels, keep on getting better. Thank you for listening to this episode of Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tell your friends that I rocked your socks. If you wear socks while listening to my pod, that's your call, not mine. And don't forget to leave a review on your podcast site of choice. You can tweet me at RTWBarefoot, and I'm the same name on YouTube, Blue Sky and Pinterest, or you can find me as Barefoot Backpacker on Instagram, Discord and Facebook. Don't forget to sign up for my newsletter, and if you really like what I do, you can slip me the cost of a beer through my Patreon in return for access to rare extra content. Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure was written, presented, edited and produced by the Barefoot Backpacker. The theme music is Walking Barefoot on Grass Bonus by Kai Engel, which is available via the Free Music Archive and used under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. Show notes are available on my website, barefoot-backpacker.com. Until next time, have safe journeys. Bye for now.